Elena Sorokin arrived at the community center 30 minutes early, parking her old blue sedan in the farthest corner of the lot. She sat for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, gathering her courage. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dashboard, highlighting the tiny cracks in her dry skin. At 47, Elena's hands told stories her quiet voice rarely shared. Years of dishwashing, scrubbing floors, and caring for other people's children had left them calloused and weathered. She reached for her worn leather handbag, a gift from her late husband on their 10th anniversary. Inside was a carefully folded sheet of music, edges soft from countless readings. Elena checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, tucking a strand of chestnut hair behind her ear. She had splurged on a haircut last week, her first in over a year, and had pressed her best dress for today. It wasn't fancy, a simple navy blue with small white flowers, but it was the nicest thing she owned. The community center had been transformed. Crystal chandeliers, normally hidden away for special occasions, cast a warm glow over the polished wooden floor. Rows of rented chairs faced the grand piano, a magnificent Steinway that had been delivered that morning. A banner hung above the small stage. Masterclass with Maestro Vittorio Casella. Elena slipped through the side entrance, hoping to blend into the background as she always did. The hall was already filling with people in expensive clothes and confident smiles. Music students clutched portfolios of sheet music, their parents hovering nearby with proud expressions. Elena felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the sensation of being in a world where she didn't belong. "Can I help you?" A young woman with a clipboard approached, her tone suggesting Elena might have wandered into the wrong building. "I'm here for the master class," Elena said softly. "My name should be on the list." The woman, whose name tag read Diane, flipped through several pages, her perfectly manicured nail running down the columns of names. Her eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Elena Sorokin? You're performing today?" Elena nodded, trying not to notice how Diane's eyes traveled over her simple dress and scuffed shoes. "You're the last one on the schedule. Sign here, please." The clipboard was thrust forward. As Elena signed her name in careful letters, she heard Diane whisper to another organizer, "That's our cleaning lady entry, the one who paid the full fee." The words stung, but they weren't unfamiliar. Elena had heard similar whispers all her life. She found a seat in the back row, positioning herself in the corner where the shadows were deepest. From here, she could see everything without being seen, a skill she had perfected over years of existing on the edges of rooms. The crowd grew, filling the hall with the pleasant hum of excitement. These people belonged here. They spoke the language of music with easy confidence, dropping names and terms that Elena had only read in the dog-eared music theory book she'd found at a yard sale. They discussed summer programs in Vienna, winter retreats in Switzerland, and competitions in New York, as if these places were just around the corner, rather than in another universe entirely. 2 seats away, a woman in an expensive silk blouse leaned toward her companion. "I heard Casella made a student cry at his last masterclass in Boston. Completely tore apart her Beethoven." "Well, you don't get to be the most sought-after piano instructor in the world by being nice," her friend replied. "My Thomas studied with him last summer. Said it was the hardest 3 weeks of his life, but his playing improved dramatically." Elena's heart hammered in her chest. She had known about Maestro Casella's reputation, of course. Everyone in the music world did. His recordings had won every major award, and his former students filled prestigious orchestras around the globe. What few people mentioned in the glowing articles was his legendary impatience with mediocrity and his cutting remarks that could shatter a student's confidence in seconds. The main doors opened, and a hush fell over the crowd. Maestro Vittorio Casella entered, his tall figure commanding immediate attention. Though in his 60s, he moved with the energy of a much younger man. His silver hair was swept back from a high forehead, and his sharp eyes missed nothing as he surveyed the room. He didn't smile or acknowledge the whispers of excitement. Instead, he walked directly to the small table set up beside the piano, placed his leather portfolio down, and nodded curtly to the event organizer. "Ladies and gentlemen," the organizer announced, her voice slightly breathless with importance, "we are honored to welcome the legendary Maestro Vittorio Casella to our humble community. As you know, the maestro rarely gives public masterclasses, and we are incredibly fortunate that he agreed to hear our local talents today as part of his charity foundation's outreach program." A polite applause followed. The maestro remained seated, checking his watch as if already counting down the minutes until he could leave. "We will hear from 8 pianists today," the organizer continued. "Each will have 15 minutes with the maestro. We ask the audience to hold all applause until invited and to refrain from recording or photography during the performances." Elena sank deeper into her chair. 15 minutes. She had practiced her piece, Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, every day for months, squeezing in practice sessions during her lunch breaks at the elementary school where she worked in the cafeteria, and late at night after her cleaning shifts at the local doctor's office. The church pastor had kindly allowed her to use the old upright piano in the basement, whenever the building was empty. The first performer was a young boy, perhaps 16, in a perfectly tailored suit. He approached the piano with practiced confidence and played a technically flawless rendition of a listitude. His fingers flew over the keys with precision that came from years of expert training. When he finished, Maestro Casella nodded once. "Your technique is acceptable," he said, his Italian accent more pronounced when he spoke. "But where is the feeling? You play like a machine." Again from the middle section. The boy played again, this time with exaggerated expression that made the maestro frown. "No, no, no. That is acting, not feeling." Next student. One by one, the performers approached the piano. Some were praised cautiously, others criticized harshly. A young woman with bright red hair played beautifully until a wrong note in the final movement caused her to stumble. The maestro sighed loudly and made a note in his book without offering any feedback. Elena watched them all, her admiration mixed with growing apprehension. These were trained musicians with years of proper instruction, and even they struggled to please the demanding maestro. What chance did she have? A self-taught cafeteria worker who practiced on an out-of-tune piano. During a short break, Elena slipped into the restroom. The bright fluorescent lights were unforgiving, highlighting the faint lines around her eyes and the permanent crease between her brows, the mark of someone who had spent a lifetime worrying. She splashed cold water on her face and tried to steady her breathing. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered to her reflection. It wasn't the first time she'd said those words to herself. She'd heard them from others, too. From her practical mother, who thought music was a frivolous pursuit. From her well-meaning husband, who gently suggested she focus on realistic goals. From the high school music teacher who had told her she had started too late to ever be good. But beneath those doubts was a deeper truth she couldn't ignore. When she played, she became whole in a way nothing else could make her. The piano was the one place where her hands, rough from work, created something beautiful. Elena returned to her seat just as the 7th performer finished. Only one more before her turn. The knot in her stomach tightened. "Our next performer had to cancel due to illness," the organizer announced, "so we'll move directly to our final participant." She glanced at her clipboard, her expression flickering with something between confusion and embarrassment. "Elena Sorokin will play Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor." All heads turned, searching the room for the unknown pianist. Elena stood slowly, clutching her handbag. The whispers started immediately. "Who is she? Never heard of her. Is she even from around here?" The walk to the piano felt endless. Elena could feel the weight of every stare, the judgment in every whispered comment. The maestro didn't even look up from his notes as she approached, his pen tapping impatiently against the table. When Elena finally reached the piano, she stood for a moment beside the magnificent instrument. It was far grander than anything she had ever played before, its polished surface reflecting the chandelier lights like a black mirror. She carefully placed her sheet music on the stand, though she wouldn't need it. The notes were burned into her memory, into her heart. "You have 5 minutes," the maestro said coldly, finally glancing up. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of her, this plainly dressed middle-aged woman who looked more like someone's housekeeper than a pianist. He checked his watch pointedly. "The program has already run long." Elena nodded silently and sat at the bench. She adjusted its height, feeling the smooth satin of the cushion beneath her. Then she placed her hands in her lap and closed her eyes. In that moment of darkness, she was no longer in a room full of strangers. She was alone with the music that had kept her company through long nights of loneliness, through grief, through joy. Her fingers rose to hover above the keys, calloused. Imperfect hands that were about to speak the only language that had ever fully expressed what lived in her heart. In the silence before her fingers touched the keys, Elena's mind drifted back to where it all began. A small village nestled between rolling hills. where time moved slowly and dreams often remained just that. Elena was 6 when she first discovered the piano. The village church had received it as a donation from a wealthy family in the city. Old and slightly out of tune, the upright piano sat in the corner of the church basement, mostly forgotten except during special occasions. One rainy Sunday after service, while the adults chatted over coffee, Elena wandered down to the basement. The room was dim, light filtering through small windows near the ceiling. And there it stood, dark wood with chipped ivory keys, some of them yellowed with age. Something pulled her toward it. Elena pressed one key, then another, delighted by the different sounds. Her small fingers moved across the keyboard, instinctively finding patterns that pleased her ear. She didn't know she was playing music. She was simply following what felt right. "What are you doing down here, little one?" Father Nikolai, the elderly priest, stood at the bottom of the stairs. Helena jumped back from the piano, afraid she'd done something wrong. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The priest's weathered face softened. "No need for sorry. Come, play some more." Hesitantly, Elena returned to the bench. Her hands found the same melody she'd been exploring, a simple folk tune her grandmother often hummed while cooking. Father Nikolai's eyes widened. "Has someone taught you to play?" Elena shook her head. "You have a gift, child," he said, sitting beside her on the bench. "A rare one." From that day forward, the church basement became Elena's sanctuary. Father Nikolai gave her permission to play whenever she wanted. He found an old music theory book and taught her the basics, how to read notes, the names of the keys, the language of music that had previously existed only in her heart. "She needs proper lessons," Father Nikolai told her parents one evening when he visited their small farmhouse. "There's a music teacher in the city who might take her as a scholarship student." Elena's father, Pavel, a sturdy man with hands rough from fieldwork, shook his head. "We can barely keep food on the table," he said. "The city is 30 miles away. How would she get there? Where would she practice? We have no piano." Her mother, Tatiana, more practical still, added, "What good will piano lessons do when she needs to learn to cook, clean, and eventually support a family? Music won't put bread on the table." Elena, listening from the hallway, felt something inside her shrink a little. She understood even then that her family's survival depended on practicality, not dreams. Still, Father Nikolai persisted. He arranged for her to continue using the church piano and brought her more books, worn secondhand music sheets and theory guides donated by the city music school. Elena absorbed everything, teaching herself compositions far beyond her years, her small hands stretching to reach difficult chords. When Elena was 12, a traveling musician visited their village. Word of the young girl who played like an angel had spread, and he asked to hear her perform. After she played a Chopin nocturne, taught to herself through determination and countless hours of practice, the musician spoke with her parents again. "Your daughter has extraordinary talent," he insisted. "She could receive a scholarship to the conservatory in the capital. She could have a real future in music." For a moment, Elena saw hope flicker in her father's eyes. But that winter was harsh. Crops failed and her father fell ill with pneumonia. Medical bills mounted, and her older brother had to leave school to work full-time. The conversation about music school never happened again. At 16, Elena took a job at the local diner. Her days filled with serving food, washing dishes, and helping her mother care for her younger siblings. The hours at the church piano grew shorter, squeezed between responsibilities that couldn't be ignored. "Life is what happens while we're making other plans," her grandmother would say, patting Elena's hand when she found her granddaughter staring wistfully out the window. "We play the hand we're dealt, my girl." By 20, Elena had almost stopped playing altogether. The diner's owner, Mikhail Sorokin, a quiet man 15 years her senior, had begun walking her home after late shifts. He was kind and steady, with gentle eyes and careful hands that fixed things others thought beyond repair. When he proposed, Elena said yes. Not with the passion of fairy tales, but with the warm certainty that comes from finding someone who sees you clearly and values what they see. Mikhail knew about her music, had heard her play once at a village wedding, and on their first anniversary, he surprised her by clearing out a corner of their small living room for an old upright piano he'd bought from a family moving away. "Your music is part of who you are," he said simply. "I don't want you to lose that, but life has a way of filling every available space. Their first child, Alexei, came within 2 years, followed by Natalia and then little Peter. The piano became a place to display family photos. Its keyboard covered most days to protect it from small, sticky fingers. Elena played lullabies sometimes, simple melodies that made her children's eyes grow heavy with sleep. But the complex pieces that once flowed from her fingers remained locked inside her heart. They moved to a larger town when Mikhail found better work at a factory. Elena took jobs cleaning houses and serving at the school cafeteria. Their children grew, each with their own talents, none of them musical, which secretly relieved Elena. She didn't want them to yearn for something just beyond reach. "Mom, why don't you play anymore?" Natalia asked once, a teenager by then, finding Elena sitting silently at the piano late one night, its cover raised but no music sounding. "I play," Elena answered, fingers hovering above the keys without pressing down. "No, I mean really play, like in those old recordings Dad keeps." Mikhail, it turned out, had recorded her years ago during rare moments when she lost herself in music, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet. He'd never mentioned it. "There's no time now," Elena said, closing the cover gently, "and my hands aren't what they were." But that wasn't entirely true. There was time occasionally, but something else had happened over the years. A wall had grown between Elena and her music, built of disappointment, practicality, and the quiet acceptance that some dreams belong to youth. Playing hurt now, each note a reminder of a path not taken. When Alexei left for university on a science scholarship, Elena felt proud. Her son would have opportunities she never did. When Natalia married and moved to the city, and then Peter enlisted in the military, the house grew quiet. Too quiet. Then came Mikhail's diagnosis: cancer, aggressive and unforgiving. 6 months, the doctor said, perhaps a year with treatment. During those long months of his illness, Elena found herself drawn back to the piano. At first, she played softly while Mikhail slept, simple tunes to fill the silence that felt too much like the one approaching. But as the weeks passed and he grew weaker, he asked for more. "Play for me," he whispered one evening, his voice thin. "Play like you used to when you thought no one was listening." And so she did. Her fingers, stiff at first, gradually remembered. She played Chopin, Beethoven, Bach, pieces she'd taught herself decades ago, flowing back as if they'd been waiting all along. "There you are," Mikhail said after one such session, his eyes brighter than they'd been in weeks. "I've missed that look on your face." He died in the spring, as the first flowers were pushing through the thawing ground. At the funeral, Father Alexei from their new church asked if she would like to play something. Elena declined. Her grief was still too raw, her music too private. But in the empty house afterward, surrounded by sympathy casseroles and the oppressive silence of absence, Elena found herself at the piano again. She played through tears, through anger, through the hollow ache of loss. She played until her fingers cramped and her back ached, and then she played more. Music became her conversation with grief, the language she used to speak with memories. Her playing changed, deeper now, more complex, informed by decades of unplayed notes and unspoken feelings. 6 months after Mikhail's death, Elena saw the flyer on the community center bulletin board. Piano masterclass with Maestro Vittorio Casella, open to local musicians. The participation fee was substantial, nearly a month's salary from her cafeteria job. "You should do it," said Vera, the school librarian who had become a friend in recent years. "Mikhail would have wanted you to." "I'm not a musician," Elena protested. "I've never had a lesson in my life." "Play for me," Vera challenged. "Right now in the school music room." Reluctantly, Elena agreed. The school piano was nothing special, but her fingers found Chopin's ballad, the piece she'd been working on in recent weeks, the one that spoke most clearly of her journey. When she finished, Vera was silent for a long moment. "The registration deadline is tomorrow," she finally said, her voice strange. "I'll drive you there myself." And now, sitting before the gleaming Steinway with the maestro's impatient eyes upon her and a room full of skeptics waiting for her failure, Elena took a deep breath. 6 months of intensive practice, of fingers worked to exhaustion after long days of serving food and cleaning floors. 6 months of reconnecting with the part of herself that had been dormant for decades. The 5 minutes the maestro had grudgingly given her would have to be enough. Elena lowered her hands to the keys and began to play. Elena's fingers hovered over the keys for just a moment too long. A cough sounded from the back of the room. Someone shifted in their seat. The maestro's pen tapped against his notepad with growing impatience. "We don't have all day," he said, his accent sharpening his words into tiny daggers. Elena nodded once, closed her eyes briefly, and began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor floated into the air. Gentle, questioning, like the beginning of a story told in whispers. For the opening bars, the audience's expressions remained unchanged. The maestro continued writing, not bothering to look up. This was exactly what they had expected. An amateur performance, technically correct but unremarkable. Then something shifted. As Elena moved into the melody, her touch changed. The notes began to breathe in a way that made several heads lift in surprise. The simple opening theme, played with a slight hesitation that was not a technical flaw but a deliberate choice, transformed into something deeply personal, as if Chopin himself was speaking through her hands, confiding secrets meant only for those who truly understood longing. A young music student in the third row leaned forward, her brow furrowing in confusion. This wasn't how her teacher had instructed her to play this piece. The tempo was wrong, the emphasis unexpected. And yet, she couldn't look away from Elena's hands moving across the keyboard with a strange grace that had nothing to do with conventional technique. Diane, the coordinator who had whispered about the cleaning lady entry, stopped scrolling through her phone. Something about the quality of silence in the room made her glance up, her fingers frozen mid-swipe. The maestro's pen slowed, then stopped. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, lifted to study Elena's posture. All wrong, hunched slightly forward, shoulders too tense. Her fingering was unconventional, clearly self-taught. She would never pass a first-year examination at any respectable conservatory. And yet, as Elena entered the central section, where Chopin's composition grows more complex and turbulent, her body seemed to transform. The tension in her shoulders became not a technical flaw, but an expression of the music's growing emotional weight. Her calloused hands, which had scrubbed countless floors and prepared thousands of school lunches, now moved with astonishing sensitivity. Each note was given exactly the weight it needed. No more, no less. In the fourth row, an elderly piano teacher who had accompanied her star pupil to the master class closed her eyes. After 50 years of teaching, she could usually identify a pianist's training within seconds. Which school, which method, which teachers had influenced their approach. But this woman, she couldn't place her. The playing was unorthodox, raw in places, but with moments of such startling insight that it was as if she had discovered certain passages for herself, without the burden of tradition telling her how they should sound. The piece continued to build, gathering momentum. Elena's hands, limited by their size and lack of formal stretching exercises, nonetheless found ways to reach the difficult intervals. Where she couldn't span the distance as written, she had discovered alternate voicings that somehow preserved the essence of what Chopin intended. The maestro set his pen down entirely now. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. Her eyes remained half-closed, not reading music. She knew the piece by heart, but looking inward at something only she could see. There was no performative emotion, no dramatic head movements or facial expressions designed to impress an audience. There was only a woman in conversation with the piano, telling a story that had been building inside her for decades. The first ripple of discomfort moved through the audience. This was not supposed to happen. The cafeteria worker in her simple dress and worn shoes was not supposed to make them feel this way, as if they were intruding on something intimate and profound. Wealthy patron who had donated generously to bring the maestro to their community whispered to his wife, "Who did you say she was again?" His wife shook her head, unable to answer, unwilling to admit she had barely glanced at the final name on the program. As Elena approached the piece's famously difficult coda, several professional musicians in the audience tensed visibly. This was where most pianists faltered. The technical demands were extreme, requiring not just skill but a kind of abandonment, a willingness to risk everything. Many technically proficient pianists played it safe here, holding back just enough to ensure they hit all the correct notes. Elena did not play it safe. Her tempo increased not just as written, but with a burning urgency that made it clear this wasn't about displaying technical prowess. The music had become necessary, like breath, like heartbeat. Her hands flew across the keyboard with a certainty that belied her lack of formal training. There were small technical flaws, a blurred passage here, a missed note there, but they vanished in the emotional truth of her interpretation. These weren't mistakes. They were human moments in a human story, and somewhere in the middle of that technically imperfect but emotionally perfect coda, the maestro's expression changed completely. The cold assessment vanished, replaced by something close to wonder. He had heard this piece performed thousands of times, had played it himself to great acclaim, had taught it to students at the world's most prestigious conservatories. But he had never heard it quite like this. Elena played as if the music had been written specifically for her life. The early promise, the long years of silence, the reawakening after loss. She played like someone who had nothing to prove and everything to say. When the final notes faded, the silence that followed was absolute. For several seconds, no one moved. Elena's hands rested in her lap, her eyes still half closed. She looked suddenly exhausted, as if the performance had taken everything she had. The maestro was the first to break the stillness. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that made several people jump. "Your name," he said, not a question but a demand. "Elena Sorokin," she answered, her voice barely audible. "Who taught you to play like that?" Elena hesitated. "No one," she said finally. "I mean, Father Nikolai showed me how to read music when I was a child." But after that, she trailed off, unable to explain the decades of learning from recordings, from books, from the music itself. The maestro shook his head in disbelief. "Impossible," he said. But there was no dismissal in his tone now, only a kind of bewilderment. A murmur ran through the audience. The young pianist who had performed earlier leaned toward her mother and whispered something. A retired piano professor in the second row was rapidly making notes on his program. "Again," the maestro said suddenly, "the section beginning at measure 68. I want to hear it again." Elena found her place and began to play. This time she was more aware of her audience, more conscious of the maestro's intense scrutiny. Some of the magic of that first complete performance was missing, replaced by a growing self-consciousness that made her fingers stiffen slightly. "No," the maestro interrupted after just a few bars. "Not like that. Like before, when you weren't thinking about me or them." He gestured impatiently at the audience. "Play it as if you are alone." Elena took a deep breath and closed her eyes fully this time. She thought of her small living room, of playing late at night with only the memory of Mikhail as an audience. She thought of all the years the music had lived inside her, waiting, and she began again. This time, the maestro stood beside the piano, watching her hands with an intensity that would have terrified her if she had allowed herself to notice. He studied her unconventional fingering, the way she used the pedal instinctively rather than as taught, the subtle shifts in timing that came not from calculation, but from emotional necessity. When she finished the section, he remained silent for a long moment. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. 30 years, he said finally. "I have been teaching for 30 years. The greatest talents, the most prestigious conservatories." He turned to face the audience, his expression a mixture of emotions too complex to name. "And then this woman walks in with no teacher, no training, and plays with more truth than most of my students will ever achieve." He turned back to Elena, who sat frozen on the bench, her hands trembling slightly now that the music no longer moved through them. "You have 5 minutes, I said. The maestro glanced at his watch, then set it deliberately on the piano. "I was wrong. We will take as long as necessary." In the audience, Diane frantically consulted her schedule. The reception was supposed to begin in 30 minutes. The maestro had a flight to catch that evening. There were donors to thank, photographs to take. "But sir," she began, rising from her seat. The maestro silenced her with a look. "Call the airport," he said. "Tell them I'll need a later flight." He turned back to Elena. "Now from the beginning again. And this time, I want you to tell me what you're thinking as you play. Where did you learn to voice that opening chord like that? Who told you to hesitate before the secondary theme?" As Elena began to explain, searching for words to describe what had always been instinct, she saw the faces in the audience shifting. The dismissal was gone, replaced by confusion, curiosity, and in some cases a reluctant admiration. The woman who had been invisible her entire life was suddenly the only person in the room anyone could see. For 2 hours, Elena sat at the grand piano, while the rest of the world disappeared around her. The scheduled reception went forward without the maestro, who refused to leave the hall. The other students and their families drifted toward the refreshments, glancing back over their shoulders at the strange scene unfolding at the piano. Again, the maestro would say, after each section they discussed, "Now try it this way. Now with more space between the notes. Now as if you're telling a secret." Elena followed his instructions, sometimes understanding what he wanted immediately, sometimes struggling to translate his artistic concepts into physical movements. Her hands, tired from a morning of scrubbing pots in the school cafeteria before her afternoon shift was covered by a sympathetic co-worker, began to cramp. Still, she played on. In the back of the hall, a small group had refused to leave. The elderly piano teacher, 2 music students from the local college, and a thin man who had said nothing during the entire masterclass remained in their seats, watching the impromptu lesson with rapt attention. "You have no idea what you're doing. Technically speaking," the maestro told Elena, not unkindly, "your approach to the keyboard is all wrong. Your posture will cause back problems in 10 years. Your fingering choices make no sense." He shook his head, then continued with something close to wonder in his voice. "And yet, when you play that passage, it's exactly right. How did you know to bring out that inner voice? It's buried in the score. Most pianists miss it entirely." Elena struggled to explain. "It just felt important," she said finally, "like someone whispering an important truth while everyone else is shouting." The maestro stared at her for a long moment, then laughed, a genuine sound of delight that made him seem decades younger. "Yes, exactly that. Chopin is always doing this, hiding the most important things beneath the surface." He turned to the small audience remaining in the back. "Did you hear that? This woman, with no formal training, has understood something it takes me years to beat into my students' heads." One of the college students shifted uncomfortably. The elderly piano teacher nodded thoughtfully. As the impromptu lesson continued, people began slipping back into the hall. Word had spread about the unusual situation. The famous maestro, known for his impatience and exacting standards, spending hours with a cafeteria worker who played like an angel. The thin man in the back eventually stood up and approached. He had a camera. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm Tom Chen from the local paper. Would it be possible to take a few photographs? And perhaps get a brief interview?" The maestro waved him away irritably. "Later, we're working now." Elena felt her face flush. "A newspaper? Pictures?" She was suddenly acutely aware of her simple dress, her hands with their broken nails, the gray strands in her hastily arranged hair. She wasn't prepared for this kind of attention. "Just one photo," the reporter persisted. "Our deadline." "I said later." The maestro's voice cracked like a whip, but the spell had been broken. Elena's self-consciousness, kept at bay while she was immersed in the music, came flooding back. Her next attempt at the passage they'd been working on fell apart, her fingers suddenly clumsy and uncooperative. The maestro sighed, recognizing what had happened. He checked his watch and seemed surprised by the time. "We've been at this for nearly 3 hours," he said. "You must be exhausted." Elena nodded, flexing her stiff fingers. In truth, it wasn't just physical tiredness. The emotional weight of the day, the initial dismissal, the unexpected recognition, the intense focus of the lesson had drained her completely. "We'll continue tomorrow," the maestro declared, as if it were already decided. 9 o'clock here." Elena blinked in surprise. "But don't you have to leave?" "Your flight changed," he said simply. "I'll stay another day." Diane, the event coordinator who had been hovering anxiously nearby, stepped forward. "Maestro Casella, there are some people from the Arts Council who've been waiting to speak with you about the funding for... Tell them to come back tomorrow." His tone left no room for argument. Turning back to Elena, his voice softened slightly. "You have a remarkable gift. Untrained, unpolished, but real. Very real." He gathered his notes, closing his leather portfolio with a decisive snap. "Be here at 9. We have much work to do." As Elena stood up from the piano bench, her legs trembling slightly with fatigue, the small crowd that had gathered began to approach. The reporter was first, his questions coming rapidly. "Mrs. Sorokin, how long have you been playing piano? Is it true you've never had formal lessons?" How did you prepare for today's masterclass? Elena looked to the maestro, unsure how to handle the sudden attention. He stepped smoothly between her and the growing crowd. Mrs. Sorokin is finished for today, he announced. She will speak with you tomorrow after our session. He turned to Elena and lowered his voice. Go home, rest your hands. Practice only the sections we discussed and not for more than 30 minutes. Your muscles need time to absorb what they've learned today. Elena nodded gratefully and gathered her things. As she made her way toward the exit, people stepped aside, looking at her with new eyes. Some smiled encouragingly. Others whispered to each other, stealing glances at her hands as if they contained some visible magic they had missed before. The elderly piano teacher stopped her near the door. I've been teaching for 40 years, she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. What you did today, it's why I became a musician in the first place. Thank you for reminding me. Before Elena could respond, the woman pressed a business card into her hand and walked away. Outside, the evening had turned cool and clear. Elena stood for a moment on the community center steps, breathing deeply, trying to process everything that had happened. The parking lot was still half full, cars belonging to those who had stayed to witness the unexpected turn of events. Her own car sat where she had left it hours earlier, in the farthest corner of the lot. The walk to it felt surreal, as if she were floating slightly above the pavement. Had it really happened? Had the world-renowned Maestro Vittorio Casella really spent 3 hours teaching her, praising her, changing his travel plans because of her playing? As she reached for her car door, a voice called her name. Elena turned to see Vera, the school librarian who had encouraged her to register for the masterclass, rushing across the parking lot. I just heard, Vera exclaimed, slightly out of breath. The whole town is talking about it. Why didn't you call me? I didn't have a chance, Elena said, still feeling dazed. It all happened so fast. Tell me everything, Vera insisted, her eyes shining with excitement. Lisa from the front office was there. Her daughter was performing, and she said the maestro completely lost his mind over your playing. She said he's staying an extra day just to work with you. Elena nodded, unable to find words that could adequately describe the experience. And someone recorded part of it on their phone. Vera continued. It's already being shared all over social media. People are saying, recorded? Elena felt a sudden chill. Who recorded it? I didn't give permission for... I don't know, but it's amazing, Elena. People need to hear you play. You've kept this hidden for too long. Elena leaned against her car, suddenly overwhelmed. The privacy of her music, the intimate conversation between herself and the piano that had sustained her through the hardest times, was becoming public without her consent. The thought made her feel exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't anticipated. I need to go home, she said quietly. I need to think. Vera studied her friend's face and seemed to understand something of what Elena was feeling. She nodded and stepped back. Call me if you need anything. And Elena, she paused, searching for the right words. Be proud. What happened today, it's what you deserve. It's what your music deserves. The drive home was a blur. Elena moved on autopilot, her mind replaying moments from the masterclass, trying to hold on to the feeling of sitting at that magnificent piano with the maestro, guiding her through passages she had struggled with for months. Her small house was dark when she arrived. She hadn't left any lights on, not expecting to be gone so long. As she turned the key in the lock, the silence inside seemed different somehow, expectant, as if the house itself sensed that its owner had changed. Elena moved through the rooms, turning on lamps, her gaze eventually coming to rest on her own piano in the corner of the living room. It looked different now, smaller perhaps than the grand Steinway she had played today, but also more personal, more intimately connected to her journey. She sat on the familiar bench and rested her hands lightly on the keys without pressing them. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more attention, more decisions about what this unexpected recognition might mean for her life. But tonight, in the quiet of her home, she allowed herself to feel something she had almost forgotten: pride. Her phone began to ring, breaking the moment. The screen showed a number she didn't recognize. Elena hesitated, then answered. Mrs. Sorokin, an unfamiliar voice, polite but eager. This is Gregory Walsh from the Riverside Arts Center. We were wondering if you might be available to give a small recital next month. The maestro spoke so highly of your playing, and we thought, as the caller continued. Elena's gaze drifted to the photographs on top of the piano, her children in various stages of growing up, Mikhail on their 20th anniversary, her parents long ago in the old village. What would they think of this strange new chapter beginning in her life? What would Mikhail say? She could almost hear his voice, gentle and certain. This is who you've always been. The world is just finally noticing. Elena took a deep breath and turned her attention back to the caller. Yes, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. Yes, I think I would be interested in playing. 3 months after the master class, Elena sat in the small waiting area backstage at the Wilson Community Theater. Through the curtains, she could hear the murmur of the audience as they settled into their seats. The concert hall wasn't large, just 200 seats, but every one of them was filled tonight. 5 minutes. Mrs. Sorokin, the stage manager said, poking his head through the door. Elena nodded, flexing her fingers gently. On her lap lay the program for the evening. An evening of Chopin and Rachmaninoff, featuring Elena Sorokin. Below her name, in smaller print, were the words that still felt strange to read. Student of Maestro Vittorio Casella. The past 3 months had been a whirlwind. After that first extended lesson following the masterclass, the maestro had not only stayed an extra day, but had arranged to return every other weekend for intensive training sessions. When he wasn't physically present, they worked over video calls. Elena positioning her laptop so he could see her hands on the keyboard of her humble upright piano. Your technique is still terrible, he had told her during their lesson last week, though the harshness of his words was softened by the hint of a smile. But it's your terrible technique now, not just random habits. We're making it work for your hands, your mind, your way of thinking about music. Elena had quit her job at the school cafeteria after the first month of lessons. The decision hadn't been easy. The regular paycheck had been a comfort since Mikhail's death, but between the practice schedule the maestro demanded, and the increasing number of small performance opportunities coming her way, something had to give. You can't serve lunch and then expect your hands to play Rachmaninoff in the evening, the maestro had insisted. Choose. Her savings wouldn't last forever, but for now she had enough to focus on music. Tonight's concert was her first paid performance, not a huge sum, but a milestone nonetheless. From cafeteria worker to paid pianist in 3 months, the thought still didn't quite feel real. A soft knock at the door pulled Elena from her thoughts. Vera entered carrying a small bunch of wildflowers. From the kids at the library story hour, she explained, handing them to Elena. They wanted to wish you luck. They've been telling everyone their librarian's friend is a famous pianist. Elena laughed softly. Hardly famous? Well, you're all over YouTube, so that's something, Vera replied with a grin. It was true. The clip someone had recorded at the master class had indeed gone viral, at least within classical music circles. Unknown cafeteria worker stuns piano maestro, read one headline. Late bloomer pianist proves it's never too late, declared another. The attention had been uncomfortable at first. Elena had never sought the spotlight, had never imagined her private musical world exposed to public view. But gradually she had come to accept it, even appreciate certain aspects of it. Each week her email inbox contained messages from people inspired by her story. Middle-aged women rediscovering abandoned passions, self-taught musicians finding courage to perform, parents rethinking their children's relationship with the arts. 2 minutes, called the stage manager. Vera squeezed Elena's hand. I'll go find my seat. He'll be magnificent. Left alone, Elena closed her eyes and focused on her breathing. The nervous fluttering in her stomach wasn't as intense as it had been before her first small recital, but it was still there. The maestro had assured her it would never completely disappear, nor should it. Nervousness is the body's way of preparing for something important, he had explained. The trick is to make it work for you, not against you. A gentle bell sounded. Her cue. Elena stood, smoothed her dress, a new one, dark blue with silver threading, a gift from her children, and walked to the stage entrance. As she stepped into the light and approached the grand piano, the audience applauded warmly. Elena made a small bow, as the maestro had taught her. Not too deep, not too long, just enough to acknowledge them before you sit, and took her place at the bench. For a moment, she allowed her gaze to move across the audience. In the third row sat her children. Alexei had flown in from the West Coast where he now worked as an engineer. Natalia had brought her husband, and Peter had arrived in his military uniform, having gotten special permission for leave. They smiled encouragingly, looking both proud and slightly bemused by their mother's unexpected second act. Near the back, Elena spotted Ms. Reynolds, the elderly piano teacher who had given her that business card after the masterclass. She had become something of a mentor to Elena, offering practical advice about navigating the local music scene and occasionally filling in when the maestro was traveling. And there, in the center of the front row, sat the maestro himself. He hadn't been scheduled to attend tonight. His touring schedule was relentless, but he had called yesterday to say he'd rearrange things to be present for her first professional recital. He nodded once when their eyes met, his expression stern as always. But Elena had learned to read the encouragement beneath the severity. She turned to the piano, placed her hands on the keys, and began to play. The first piece was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, deceptively simple on the surface but requiring deep emotional control. As she played, Elena thought about how differently she approached the keyboard now. The maestro had reshaped her technique in countless ways, correcting positioning, teaching her efficient finger movements, showing her how to use her whole body instead of just her hands, and yet, beneath all those technical adjustments, the core of her playing remained uniquely her own. The maestro had been insistent about that. "I could make you play like a proper conservatory graduate," he had told her, "but then you would lose what makes your playing special. We will build your technique around your voice, not the other way around." As she moved from the nocturne into a more challenging ballade, Elena felt herself settling into the familiar state where the audience faded and only the music remained. This communion with the piano, once her private refuge, now happened in public view. It had been the hardest adjustment of all, learning to maintain that intimate connection while being observed. The ballade built to its dramatic conclusion, Elena's newly strengthened fingers meeting its technical demands with growing confidence. As the final chord resonated through the hall, the audience burst into applause that seemed too large for the small venue. Elena rose for another small bow, then returned to the piano for the second half of her program. This portion featured Rachmaninoff, music she would never have attempted before the maestro's training. As she launched into the prelude in G minor, she remembered their argument over this piece. "Too soon," the maestro had insisted. "Your hands are not ready." "They will be," Elena had replied with uncharacteristic stubbornness. "This piece, it speaks to me. I need to play it." After weeks of specific exercises designed to build the strength and flexibility her hands would need, the maestro had finally relented. "Not perfect," he'd acknowledged after her first complete playthrough, "but honest. The audience will forgive technical imperfections if they believe the emotional truth behind them." As Elena reached the thunderous climax of the prelude, she could feel the truth of those words. Her interpretation wasn't flawless. A few notes in the massive chords didn't speak clearly. Some of the fastest passages weren't perfectly even, but the music lived and breathed. She was telling a story through her playing, the story of struggle and resilience, of dreams deferred but not abandoned, of finding voice after long silence. When the final piece ended, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Helena bowed again, her heart pounding, a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration flowing through her. As the applause continued, she glanced at the maestro, who remained seated, his face impassive. But as their eyes met, he gave an almost imperceptible nod, the highest praise he ever offered. After 3 curtain calls, Elena finally retreated backstage, where her children waited to embrace her. Alexei handed her a small wrapped package. "From Dad," he said quietly. Elena unwrapped it carefully to find an antique metronome. Attached was a note in Mikhail's handwriting. "For when you're ready to share your music with the world." I always knew this day would come. The note was dated just weeks before his death. Somehow he had known before she did that this moment would arrive. Later, after the reception had ended and the theater emptied, Elena sat alone on the bench, her fingers resting lightly on the keys of the grand piano. In 2 days she would return to her regular practice schedule. In 2 weeks, the maestro would arrive for their next lesson, undoubtedly with new challenges and higher expectations. In 3 months, she was scheduled to play at a larger venue in the city, a frightening but exciting prospect. Life had changed, in ways she could never have imagined. On that day, she'd slipped unnoticed into the community center for the masterclass. The path ahead wasn't clear. At her age, she would never have the career of a traditional concert pianist. but it was rich with possibilities that hadn't existed before. Still here? The maestro's voice broke the silence. He walked onto the stage, his formal performance attire replaced by a more casual sweater and slacks. Just thinking, Elena replied. He sat beside her on the bench, an unusual breach of the formal teacher-student relationship he typically maintained. You played well tonight, he said simply. Thank you. What comes next is up to you, he continued, his gaze focused somewhere in the middle distance. You could continue as you are, local performances, gradual improvement, perhaps some teaching of your own eventually. It would be a good musical life, Elena nodded, waiting for the but she could hear coming in his tone. But, the maestro said, right on cue, there is another possibility. He turned to look directly at her. I'm starting a program at the conservatory for exceptional adult musicians who came to formal training late. A different path, but a serious one. Elena's breath caught. The conservatory was in the city, hours away from her small town, her home, her familiar life. Think about it, the maestro said, standing up. Not everyone gets a second beginning. Sometimes not even a first. But you, Elena Sorokin, he paused, choosing his words carefully. You have been given both. What you do with them will be entirely your own choice. As he walked away, Elena turned back to the piano. Her fingers found a simple melody, one she had created herself during those long nights after Mikhail's death. Not Chopin, not Rachmaninoff, just Elena, speaking through music in her own voice, finally being heard.